The morning sun cast a golden glow over Kensington Palace as the household staff moved quietly through the corridors. Inside the private royal apartments, Kate stood before a full-length mirror while her hairstylist carefully arranged each strand into place. The ivory gown she wore had been designed specifically for this historic day, embroidered with delicate floral patterns that represented all 4 nations of the United Kingdom. The fabric caught the light beautifully, and she could feel the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. In the adjoining room, Prince William adjusted his ceremonial robes with practiced hands. He had worn military uniforms countless times before, but today felt different. This was not just another royal engagement or state occasion. His father was about to be crowned king, and the entire world would be watching. He glanced at his reflection, seeing not just himself but generations of royal tradition staring back. The responsibility felt heavier than the medals pinned to his chest. Down the hallway, young Prince George sat unusually still as his nanny helped him into his formal attire. At his age, he understood that something important was happening, though the full significance would only become clear to him years later. He kept tugging at his collar, finding the stiff fabric uncomfortable. His mother had explained that today was special, that his grandfather was receiving a very important crown, and that everyone needed to look their absolute best. Princess Charlotte twirled in front of her mirror, delighted with her dress. Unlike her brother, she seemed to relish the formality of the occasion. She had been practicing her curtsy for weeks, determined to get it perfect. Her small tiara caught the morning light, making her feel like she had stepped into one of the fairy tales her mother read to her at bedtime. She asked her nanny repeatedly if she looked like a real princess, seeking reassurance that she would make her family proud. Little Prince Louis bounced on his bed, his energy barely contained by the formal clothes he wore. At his young age, the solemnity of the occasion meant little compared to the excitement of riding in a fancy car and seeing all the people. His nanny tried to calm him down, explaining that he would need to sit very still during the ceremony. He nodded enthusiastically, though everyone suspected his good behavior might not last the entire day. Kate finished her preparations and walked down to check on the children. She found George looking nervous, Charlotte beaming with excitement, and Louis already rumpled despite having been dressed only minutes before. She knelt down to their level, speaking softly to each of them. To George, she gave words of encouragement, reminding him that he had done this before and would do wonderfully. She praised Charlotte's curtsy, which the young girl immediately demonstrated again. For Louis, she simply smiled and straightened his collar, knowing that expecting perfection from him would be unrealistic. William joined his family in the nursery, and for a moment the formal occasion faded into the background. He was simply a father with his children, sharing a quiet moment before stepping into the public eye. He picked up Louis, holding him close, then put a reassuring hand on George's shoulder. Charlotte grabbed his other hand, squeezing it tightly. These small gestures of connection meant everything in a life so often lived in front of cameras and crowds. The call came that the cars were ready. The family made their way down the palace stairs, their footsteps echoing in the grand entrance hall. Staff members lined up to see them off, offering respectful nods and warm smiles. These were people who saw them every day, who understood the pressure of royal life, who genuinely cared about this family beyond their titles and positions. Outside, the official vehicles waited in pristine condition. The cars had been polished until they gleamed, each one a symbol of British craftsmanship and royal tradition. Security personnel stood at attention, having spent weeks preparing for this day. Every route had been checked, every contingency planned for. Nothing could be left to chance when it came to the safety of the royal family. Kate helped the children into their designated car, making sure everyone was comfortable and secure. She smoothed down Charlotte's dress and whispered something that made the young girl giggle. George sat up straight, already adopting the formal posture he had been taught. Louis pressed his face against the window, waving at anyone and everyone, much to the amusement of the security staff. William took one last look at the palace before climbing into the car with Kate. The building had been their home for years, a place where they could be relatively normal despite their extraordinary circumstances. But today, they were leaving as representatives of the crown, as key figures in a ceremony that would be remembered for generations. The private William and Kate would have to wait until they returned home that evening. As the convoy began to move, Crowds were already gathering along the route. People had camped out overnight, determined to get the best view of the royal procession. Flags waved in the morning breeze, and the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. This was not just a British celebration, but a global event, with people from around the world traveling to witness history in the making. Inside the car, Kate held William's hand briefly, a small gesture of support that spoke volumes. They had faced many public events together, but this one held special significance. They were not just attending a coronation, they were stepping into their future roles. William was now officially the heir to the throne, and their children represented the continuation of the monarchy into the next generation. The children's car followed closely behind, and through the rear window Kate could see George looking out at the crowds. She wondered what he was thinking, what he understood about his future. He was still so young, yet already the weight of expectation rested on his small shoulders. She made a mental note to talk with him later, to make sure he knew he was loved for who he was, not just for what he would one day become. The convoy turned onto the mall, and the crowds grew thicker. The noise became louder as people cheered and waved. Camera crews from every major network in the world lined the route, broadcasting the procession to millions of viewers. Helicopters circled overhead, capturing aerial footage of the perfectly orchestrated parade. Everything had been timed to the minute, choreographed with military precision. Westminster Abbey loomed ahead, its ancient stones holding centuries of history. Kings and queens had been crowned there for nearly 1,000 years, and today would add another chapter to that story. The building stood as a testament to continuity, to tradition, to the enduring nature of the British monarchy despite all the changes the world had seen. As the cars approached the Abbey, William took a deep breath. Kate noticed and gave him an encouraging smile. Whatever awaited them inside, whatever challenges the future would bring, they would face it together as a family. The cars slowed down, preparing to stop at the entrance where the Archbishop and other dignitaries waited to receive them. The moment had arrived. The cars came to a gentle stop at the entrance of Westminster Abbey, and immediately a flurry of activity began around them. Royal protection officers stepped forward, opening doors with practiced efficiency. Camera shutters clicked like 1,000 tiny drums, capturing every second of the arrival. The world held its breath as the car door opened, and Kate stepped out onto the red carpet that had been laid specially for this occasion. She moved with the grace that had become her trademark over the years of royal service. The ivory gown flowed behind her as she walked, and the intricate embroidery caught the light from countless camera flashes. Her jewelry had been chosen carefully, pieces that held historical significance while still complementing her modern elegance. She wore a smile that seemed effortless, though inside her heart raced with the magnitude of the moment. William emerged next, his military uniform displaying his rank and service to the nation. He stood tall, shoulders back, every inch the future king, but as he waited for the children to exit their vehicle, his expression softened slightly. He was still a father, still a husband, even in the midst of all this ceremony and tradition. His eyes scanned the crowd, taking in the sea of faces, the cameras, the historic architecture surrounding them. The children's car door opened, and George stepped out first. He had been coached on exactly how to exit the vehicle, how to stand, where to look. He followed these instructions perfectly, though his young face showed the concentration it required. He blinked in the bright sunlight and the flash of cameras, momentarily overwhelmed by the sheer number of people watching him. His mother's presence nearby gave him courage, and he walked forward to join his parents. Charlotte emerged like a vision, her dress perfect, her small tiara sitting proudly on her head. She had waited for this moment with such excitement, and now that it had arrived, she seemed to glow with joy. Unlike her brother, she appeared completely comfortable in the spotlight. She waved to the crowd, a gesture that drew delighted cheers from the spectators. Her confidence and charm were already evident, traits that would serve her well in her future royal role. Louis came last, held by his nanny initially to ensure he did not run off in excitement. When placed on the ground, he looked around with wide eyes, taking in the enormous building, the crowds of people, the soldiers in their formal uniforms. Everything was bigger and more impressive than he had imagined. He reached for his mother's hand instinctively, suddenly feeling small in this vast and overwhelming environment. The family gathered together at the base of the Abbey steps. This was a moment the photographers had been waiting for. The entire family together in their coronation finery. William placed a hand on George's shoulder. Kate held Louis's hand while Charlotte stood beside her. They presented a picture of unity and continuity, the modern face of an ancient institution. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood at the Abbey entrance, resplendent in his ceremonial robes. He had performed many important services in his career, but this coronation carried special weight. He smiled warmly at the arriving family, offering a few quiet words of welcome that were lost in the noise of the crowd. His presence represented the deep connection between the Church of England and the British monarchy, a relationship that dated back centuries. Other senior members of the royal family had already arrived and were positioned inside the Abbey. They had followed strict protocol regarding arrival, times and seating arrangements. Every detail of the ceremony had been planned months in advance with nothing left to chance. The service would follow traditions that had been refined over generations, with only minor updates to reflect the modern era. As William and his family prepared to enter the Abbey, a fanfare sounded. The bright notes of the trumpets echoed off the ancient stones, announcing their arrival to everyone assembled inside. The sound gave Kate goosebumps despite the warmth of the day. This was not just music. It was history being made audible, tradition being given voice. The great doors of the Abbey stood open, revealing the magnificent interior beyond. Centuries of history seemed to emanate from those walls. Kings and queens, poets and scientists, heroes and leaders were buried or commemorated within. To walk through those doors was to step into the continuous story of the nation itself. Every coronation added another chapter to that ongoing narrative. The children looked up at the soaring Gothic architecture with wonder. The ceiling seemed impossibly high. The stained glass windows cast colorful patterns of light across the stone floors, and the rows of pews were filled with the most important people in British society and representatives from nations around the world. Charlotte squeezed her mother's hand tighter, suddenly feeling the solemnity of the occasion. George walked beside his father, trying to match his stride and bearing. He had been told repeatedly about the importance of today, about how people around the world would be watching. The weight of his future seemed to press down on him as they approached the entrance. He wanted to make his family proud, to do everything right, to not disappoint anyone. Inside the Abbey, 2,000 guests waited in respectful silence. Foreign royalty sat alongside elected leaders. Military officers in dress uniforms occupied some pews, while others held distinguished citizens who had been honored with invitations to this historic event. Every seat had been claimed months ago, with people feeling privileged just to be present. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Kate could hear the choir warming up somewhere deep within the Abbey. Their voices carried an ethereal quality in that sacred space, as if the building itself was designed to make human voices sound divine. She had attended many services here over the years, but today felt entirely different. Today, everything mattered more. A royal aide stepped forward to give final instructions and check that everyone was ready. The children were reminded one last time to walk slowly, to stay together, to remember their manners. Charlotte nodded seriously, George swallowed nervously, and Louis simply stared at all the interesting things around him. Kate and William exchanged one more glance, a moment of silent communication between two people who knew each other completely. The procession began to form in the proper order. There were rules about who walked where, who preceded whom, what distance should be maintained. These protocols had been established over centuries and were not to be altered lightly. William and his family would walk after certain other royals, but before others, their position in the line reflecting their place in the line of succession. The music inside the Abbey changed, becoming more formal and processional. This was the signal that the ceremony was about to begin. The guests inside rose to their feet in anticipation. Outside, the crowds pressed forward, hoping for one more glimpse of the royal family before they disappeared into the Abbey. William took the first step forward, and his family followed. They passed from the bright sunlight into the dimmer interior of the Abbey, their eyes needing a moment to adjust. The temperature dropped noticeably as they entered the ancient stone building. The smell of incense and old wood filled the air, scents that had permeated this space for generations. As they walked down the aisle, Every eye in the building turned to watch them. Camera crews positioned at strategic locations captured their progress, beaming the images to viewers around the globe. Kate kept her expression serene and her posture perfect. Years of training making these things second nature now. Beside her, Louis looked around with undisguised curiosity, occasionally pointing at something that caught his eye. The choir began to sing, their voices rising in a hymn that had been sung at coronations for hundreds of years. The Latin words echoed through the vaulted ceiling, creating a sense of timelessness. This ceremony connected them to every monarch who had been crowned before, an unbroken chain stretching back through the centuries. They approached their designated seats, positioned where they would have a clear view of the coronation itself. William and Kate would witness the moment Charles officially became king, the crown being placed upon his head by the archbishop. Their children would see their grandfather transformed from prince to monarch, though the younger ones might not fully understand what they were witnessing. As they took their seats, the processional music continued. Other members of the royal family were still entering, each taking their proper place according to precedent and protocol. The ceremony was like a carefully choreographed dance, with everyone knowing their role and performing it flawlessly. The abbey filled with the sound of the great organ, its powerful notes reverberating through the ancient space. Kate settled into her seat, making sure the children were comfortable and properly arranged. Charlotte sat between her parents, her back straight with determination to behave perfectly. George was positioned where he could see everything clearly, his young face serious with concentration. Louis sat on Kate's other side, already fidgeting slightly despite the ceremony having barely begun. William looked straight ahead toward the altar where his father would soon stand. His expression remained carefully neutral, but Kate could sense the emotion churning beneath the surface. This was his father's day of triumph, the culmination of decades of waiting and preparation. But it was also a reminder that one day, William himself would stand at that altar, would feel the weight of the crown, would take on the full burden of monarchy. The great procession began in earnest as senior clergy members entered in their elaborate vestments. They carried religious artifacts that had been used in coronations for centuries, objects that held deep symbolic meaning. The sword of state, the orb, the scepter with the cross. Each item represented different aspects of royal power and responsibility. Charlotte watched with fascination as these treasures passed by, their gold surfaces catching the light from the chandeliers above. George tried to sit as still as his father, mimicking William's posture and bearing. He understood in his own way that what he was witnessing today would one day be his own destiny. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. He glanced at his father occasionally, taking comfort in William's steady presence. If his father could handle all this responsibility, perhaps one day he could too. The choir's voices soared through a particularly beautiful passage, and Kate felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, knowing that cameras would capture any display of emotion. But the music, the setting, the historic significance of the moment all combined to create something deeply moving. This was not just a ceremony. It was a connection to centuries of history, to the very foundation of the nation. Louis began to swing his legs, bored already despite the grandeur surrounding him. Kate placed a gentle hand on his knee, a silent reminder to be still. He looked up at her with big eyes and stopped for a moment, but she knew it would not last long. At his age, asking him to sit quietly through a ceremony lasting hours was perhaps expecting too much. She had brought small, quiet toys in her bag as a last resort, though she hoped not to need them. The moment arrived when Charles himself entered the abbey. The entire congregation rose to their feet as one, the rustling of fabric and movement creating a wave of sound that swept through the space. William straightened even further, watching his father walk down the aisle toward his destiny. Charles looked dignified in his ceremonial robes, every inch a king even before the crown touched his head. Kate watched her father-in-law with respect and affection. She had known him for many years now, had seen him as a grandfather to her children, as a passionate advocate for the causes he believed in. Today he would take on the role he had been preparing for his entire life. She felt proud to be part of this family, to witness this historic transition of power. Charlotte craned her neck to see better as Charles passed their row. She waved slightly, forgetting for a moment where she was, but Kate gently lowered her hand. There would be time for family interactions later. Right now, they were not just relatives. They were participants in a formal state ceremony. Every gesture, every expression would be analyzed and discussed by millions of people. The Archbishop began the formal religious service, his voice carrying authority and reverence. He spoke of duty, of service, of the sacred responsibility being undertaken. The words had been spoken at coronations for generations, linking this moment to every crowning that had come before. The weight of tradition filled the abbey, making the very air feel thick with history. George listened intently to the Archbishop's words, trying to understand their meaning. Some of it was too complex for his young mind, but he grasped the essential message. Being king meant serving others, putting the needs of the country above personal desires. He glanced at his father again, wondering if William ever wished for a different life, a simpler existence without all these rules and expectations. The ceremony progressed through its various stages, each one rich with symbolism. Charles was presented with different objects, each representing an aspect of royal authority. He was anointed with holy oil, a deeply sacred moment that connected the monarchy to divine authority. A screen was placed around him for this most private part of the ceremony, something only the Archbishop and a few others would witness directly. Kate noticed Louis starting to get restless again. He whispered something to her, probably asking when they could leave. She whispered back that they needed to stay just a little longer, that this was very important. He sighed dramatically but settled back into his seat. She made a mental note to praise him later for doing his best to behave, even if he had not been perfect. Charlotte remained captivated by everything happening around her. She watched the choir members, the clergy in their elaborate robes, the way the light streamed through the stained glass windows creating patterns on the stone floor. She was storing up every detail to remember later, to tell her friends about when she returned to school. Not every little girl got to attend a coronation, and she knew how special this was. The moment approached when the crown would actually be placed on Charles's head. The abbey seemed to hold its breath collectively. Even Louis stopped fidgeting for a moment, sensing that something important was about to happen. The St. Edward's crown was brought forward, glittering with precious stones heavy with both physical weight and historical significance. William watched as the Archbishop lifted the crown high for all to see. In that piece of gold and jewels resided the very symbol of monarchy, the physical representation of royal authority. It had crowned monarchs for centuries, and today it would crown his father. One day, distant but inevitable, it would crown him. The thought made his heart beat faster. The crown was lowered onto Charles's head, and in that instant the transition was complete. The congregation erupted in shouts of "God save the King." The ancient words echoed through the abbey, repeated by 2,000 voices in unison. Outside, gun salutes would be firing, bells would be ringing across the nation, and people would be celebrating in the streets. Kate felt William tense beside her and reached for his hand briefly. This moment changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Charles had been preparing for this his entire life, and yet the reality of it must be overwhelming. William now stood one step closer to the throne himself, and their son George one step closer after that. The future had arrived, ready or not. The newly crowned king moved through the rest of the ceremony with dignity and grace. He took oaths, received homage from the Archbishop and other senior clergy, and sat upon the coronation chair that had been used since 1308. Every gesture, every word, every moment was laden with meaning and tradition. George watched his grandfather with a mixture of awe and something else he could not quite name. Pride, perhaps, or recognition of shared destiny. One day he would sit where his grandfather sat now, would feel the weight of that crown, would speak those same oaths. The thought was too big to fully comprehend, but it sat in his mind like a seed that would grow over time. The ceremony continued with the crowning of Camilla as queen consort. Charlotte watched with particular interest as another crown was placed, this one designed specifically for this occasion. She wondered what it felt like to wear a crown, if it was heavy, if it hurt. Her own small tiara suddenly felt very light and insignificant in comparison. Music filled the abbey again as the newly crowned king and queen processed to their thrones. The choir sang with renewed energy, their voices celebrating this historic moment. Cameras captured every angle, every expression, broadcasting the ceremony to millions of viewers around the world. This was Britain at its most traditional, its most ceremonial, showcasing centuries of unbroken monarchy. As the main crowning concluded, there was a palpable sense of relief mixed with triumph in the air. The most critical part had been completed successfully. Now came the formal recognitions, the playing of national anthem, the various presentations and acknowledgments. William and his family remained in their seats, still part of the ceremony even as the focus shifted. Louis whispered urgently to his mother, and Kate realized he needed to use the bathroom. She had been dreading this possibility. There was no good time to leave during a coronation, but young children had needs that could not be ignored. She signaled discreetly to an aide, who appeared silently at her side to help escort Louis out as unobtrusively as possible. George felt his brother leave, but kept his eyes forward, determined not to be distracted. He was the eldest, the heir after his father, and he needed to set an example. His mother had told him this many times, and today he understood what she meant. People were watching him, judging him, seeing in him the future of the monarchy. It was a lot of pressure for such young shoulders. The ceremony entered its final stages as hymns of celebration filled the abbey. Louis returned to his seat looking relieved and slightly more energetic. Kate welcomed him back with a gentle smile, grateful that the small crisis had been managed discreetly. Around them, the congregation remained standing, singing along with the choir to traditional hymns that most British people had known since childhood. William's voice joined the singing, the familiar words coming automatically after years of attending services in this very building. He had been baptized here, had attended countless royal occasions within these walls, and would one day return for his own coronation. The continuity of it all was both comforting and daunting. Nothing changed, and yet everything was constantly evolving. Charlotte sang enthusiastically, her clear young voice blending with those around her. She knew some of the words from church services she had attended and made up the parts she did not know, her lips moving even when no sound emerged. She was determined to participate fully in every aspect of the day, to be worthy of the beautiful dress she wore and the important family she belonged to. The newly crowned king and queen remained seated on their thrones, accepting the homage of various dignitaries and representatives. Each person approached, bowed or curtsied with varying degrees of grace, and spoke words of loyalty and support. It was a long process, but necessary to include representatives from across the Commonwealth and around the world. George watched these exchanges with interest, studying how people approached the throne, how they addressed his grandfather. One day, people would approach him the same way, would bow before him, would pledge their loyalty. He tried to imagine himself in his grandfather's position, but could not quite manage it. The gap between his current reality and that future seemed impossibly wide. Kate observed her father-in-law with affection and respect. Charles had waited so long for this moment, longer than any heir in British history. There had been times when people questioned whether it would ever happen, whether he would step aside for William instead. But here he was, crowned at last, looking every inch a king despite the years of waiting. The Archbishop delivered a blessing over the congregation, his arms raised in benediction. The ancient words washed over the assembled crowd, speaking of guidance, protection, and divine favor. Regardless of personal religious beliefs, the moment held power. Something about the setting, the ceremony, the history all combined to create a sense of the sacred. Louis started to swing his legs again, clearly reaching the limit of his patience. Kate could not blame him. Even adults were finding the length of the ceremony challenging, and he was just a small child. She placed a comforting hand on his back, silently telling him they would be leaving soon. He looked up at her with hope in his eyes, and she nodded slightly. The national anthem played, and everyone rose to their feet one final time. The music swelled through the abbey, voices joining in the familiar words. George stood straight and sang clearly, having practiced this many times. Charlotte sang with enthusiasm, her voice occasionally louder than necessary. Louis moved his mouth, but no sound came out, more interested in watching everyone else than participating himself. As the anthem concluded, there was a moment of profound silence. 2,000 people stood motionless, the weight of what they had just witnessed settling upon them. They had been present for history, had seen a new monarch crowned, had participated in a tradition stretching back over 1,000 years. The silence held reverence, gratitude, and a sense of collective accomplishment. Then the great organ burst into life again, playing a triumphant recessional. This music was joyful, celebratory, marking the successful completion of the ceremony. The newly crowned king and queen would soon process out of the abbey, followed by the royal family in order of precedence. The carefully orchestrated exit would take time, but it marked the transition from sacred ceremony to public celebration. William prepared himself mentally for the procession out. They would walk back down that long aisle with every eye upon them, emerge into the bright sunlight where massive crowds waited, and then proceed to Buckingham Palace for the balcony appearance. The day was far from over, but this portion of it was nearly complete. Kate checked the children one more time, smoothing Charlotte's dress, straightening George's collar, and making sure Louis looked presentable after his bathroom excursion. They needed to look perfect for the exit, for the photographs that would appear in newspapers and online around the world. Every detail mattered. Every image would be scrutinized. The king and queen began their procession out, moving slowly and majestically down the aisle. They paused occasionally to acknowledge particular guests or dignitaries. Cameras flashed constantly, recording every step of their journey. Outside, the crowds would be going wild with excitement, but inside the abbey, dignity and decorum still ruled. As they passed William and his family, Charles caught his son's eye briefly. A look passed between them, something too complex to articulate in words. Pride, love, mutual understanding of the burden they both carried. William inclined his head in respect, acknowledging his father not just as parent but as sovereign. The moment lasted only seconds but felt weighted with meaning. George watched his grandfather pass, the crown now sitting on his head, the robes flowing behind him. He looked different somehow, transformed by the ceremony into something more than just his grandfather. He was now the king, the head of state, the symbol of the nation. George felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach, knowing that one day he would undergo a similar transformation. The procession continued with other senior royals falling into line according to protocol. Soon it would be time for William and his family to join the exit. Kate gathered her things, checked the children one final time, and prepared to stand. Years of royal training had taught her to move gracefully, even when wearing elaborate gowns and jewelry, to smile naturally even when exhausted, to make every gesture appear effortless. Charlotte bounced slightly with excitement, thrilled that they would finally be moving. She had been so good for so long, sitting still when every instinct told her to explore and play. Now they would walk through the abbey again and everyone would watch them, and she would get to wave to people. The thought made her heart race with joy. The signal came that it was their turn to join the procession. William stood first, helping Kate to her feet with the practiced courtesy of a gentleman. George stood on his own, trying to match his father's bearing. Charlotte took her mother's hand, and Louis was scooped up by an aide who would ensure he made it down the aisle without incident. They began to walk, their steps measured and deliberate. The organ music continued, triumphant and joyful. People in the pews watched them pass, some wiping away tears, others smiling broadly. The Prince and Princess of Wales, along with their children, represented the future of the monarchy just as clearly as Charles represented its present. George walked beside his father, very aware of the cameras pointing at them. He kept his expression neutral, his posture correct, just as he had been taught, but inside his mind raced with thoughts and feelings too complex for his age. He was proud of his grandfather, proud of his family, but also aware of the weight of expectation that now pressed upon him more heavily than ever. Kate moved with the grace that had become her signature, the ivory gown flowing behind her like a dream. She acknowledged no one specifically as they walked, keeping her gaze forward and her expression serene. But she was acutely aware of everything around her, the children's behavior, William's tension, the cameras tracking their every move. Charlotte tried to look at everything at once as they walked. The beautiful windows, the elaborate decorations, the people in their finest clothes all competed for her attention. She wanted to remember every detail, to store it away in her memory. This was the most special day she had experienced in her young life, and she knew instinctively that few days would ever match it. As they neared the exit, the sound from outside grew louder. The crowds had been waiting for hours, and their excitement was reaching a fever pitch. The roar of thousands of voices created a wall of sound that penetrated even the thick stone walls of the abbey. They were ready to see their royal family, to celebrate this historic day together. The bright sunlight hit them as they emerged from the abbey, temporarily blinding after the dimmer interior. The noise became deafening, a wave of sound that seemed almost physical in its intensity. Thousands upon thousands of people lined the streets, many waving flags, all cheering with genuine enthusiasm. The outpouring of support and affection was overwhelming. William paused at the top of the Abbey steps, Kate beside him, their children arranged around them. This was another photo opportunity, another moment for the cameras. They stood there, a family united, representing continuity and hope for the future. The crowd's cheers reached a crescendo, a sound that would echo in their memories for years to come. The royal cars waited at the base of the Abbey steps, each one positioned precisely according to the detailed plans that had been finalized months ago. The vehicles gleamed in the sunlight, their surfaces polished to perfection. Security personnel stood at attention, their eyes constantly scanning the crowds for any sign of threat. Though the atmosphere was entirely celebratory, William helped Kate down the steps, a gesture that appeared natural and caring to the watching crowds, but was also deeply ingrained royal protocol. Charlotte walked carefully, conscious of her dress and determined not to trip. George descended with measured steps, already adopting the careful public persona that would become second nature to him over the years. Louis was carried, much to his frustration, as no one trusted him to navigate the steps safely in the excitement of the moment. The cheers of the crowd intensified as the family appeared fully in view. Flags waved frantically and people pressed forward against the barriers, hoping for a better view or perhaps a wave in their direction. The police and security staff maintained order with practiced efficiency, keeping everyone safe while allowing the celebration to continue unimpeded. Kate paused before entering the car, turning to wave at the crowd. The gesture sparked another roar of approval. She had become beloved by the British public over the years, seen as bringing a touch of normalcy and grace to the royal family. Her smile was genuine as she acknowledged their support, feeling grateful for their presence on this historic day. Charlotte waved enthusiastically, delighting in the crowd's response. Every time she waved, the cheers grew louder, which made her want to wave more. Her mother gently guided her into the car, knowing they needed to maintain the schedule. The procession to Buckingham Palace would take them through the heart of London, where even more crowds waited to catch a glimpse of the newly crowned king and his family. George climbed into the car, relief washing over him as he left the intense scrutiny of the cameras. Inside the vehicle, he could relax slightly, though he knew more public appearances awaited them. He looked out the window at the sea of faces, all of them happy and celebrating. It was overwhelming to think that these people cared so much about his family, about what had happened in the Abbey today. William settled into his seat as the car doors closed, muffling the noise from outside. For a moment, there was relative quiet, a brief respite from the intensity of the ceremony and the crowds. He exchanged a look with Kate, a silent communication between two people who had shared countless royal events together. They were both tired, but the day was far from over. The procession began to move, slowly making its way through the streets of London. The route had been carefully planned to take them past the maximum number of spectators while maintaining security protocols. Every inch of the way was lined with people, some who had been standing for hours, others who had camped overnight to secure the best spots. Inside the car, Louis finally calmed down, fascinated by the crowds outside. He pointed at different things he saw: flags, costumes, people waving. His running commentary made Charlotte giggle, and even George smiled at his younger brother's enthusiasm. The formal tension of the Abbey was beginning to fade, replaced by the more familiar dynamics of a family together. Kate watched the crowds with genuine interest and affection. She had grown to understand the British people's deep connection to the monarchy, their desire to be part of historic moments. These were not just curious onlookers. They were people who felt personally invested in the royal family, who saw the monarchy as part of their national identity. The procession passed through Admiralty Arch, and Buckingham Palace came into view. The grand building stood at the end of the mall, flags flying from its roof, looking every inch the royal residence it had been for centuries. The Victoria Memorial gleamed in the sunlight, and beyond the palace gates even more crowds had gathered, hoping to see the family appear on the famous balcony. William felt a mix of emotions as they approached the palace: pride in his father's achievement, awareness of his own future responsibilities, love for his family, and a touch of exhaustion from the long ceremony. The day had been emotionally intense, even beyond the physical demands of the formal clothing and extended sitting. The cars passed through the palace gates, and suddenly the noise of the crowds diminished. The forecourt was clear except for palace staff and security, creating a bubble of relative calm. The vehicles came to a stop at the main entrance, and doors were opened by waiting attendants. George stepped out of the car and looked up at the familiar building. He had been here countless times for family gatherings, official events, and casual visits with his great-grandmother before she passed. But today it felt different, more significant. Today his grandfather had been crowned king, and the palace was the epicenter of the celebration. Inside, palace staff had been working throughout the ceremony to prepare for the return of the royal family. Refreshments had been laid out in one of the staterooms, giving everyone a chance to rest briefly before the balcony appearance. The room buzzed with quiet activity as various family members arrived and congregated. Charlotte's eyes went wide as she entered the grand reception room. Tables held elaborate displays of food and drinks, all prepared to royal standards. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandeliers, and everything looked almost too beautiful to touch. She wondered if she was allowed to eat anything or if it was just for looking at. Kate immediately sought out the children's refreshments, knowing they would need energy for the balcony appearance and the rest of the day's events. She helped Louis with a drink, checked that George had what he needed, and made sure Charlotte ate something despite being too excited to feel hungry. Even in the midst of national celebration, she remained first and foremost a mother. William found himself surrounded by family members, everyone sharing their thoughts on the ceremony, on how well it had gone, on the crowd's enthusiastic response. He engaged in these conversations while keeping one eye on his children, making sure they were managing the continued excitement and attention. The newly crowned king and queen entered the room, and conversation paused as everyone turned to congratulate them. Charles looked tired but happy, the weight of the crown now both literal and figurative. He sought out William among the gathered family members, and father and son shared a moment of connection amidst the chaos of the celebration. George watched his grandfather move through the room, noticing how everyone deferred to him now in a way that felt different from before. The ceremony had changed something fundamental, had elevated Charles to a new status that everyone instinctively recognized. It was a lesson in the power of ritual and tradition to transform reality. A palace official appeared to announce that it was nearly time for the balcony appearance. This sparked a flurry of activity as people checked their appearance, adjusted clothing, and prepared to face the crowds once more. This would be one of the most photographed moments of the day. The royal family together on the famous balcony, waving to their subjects. Kate took Charlotte to quickly freshen up, making sure the little girl's dress was still perfect and her tiara sat straight. Charlotte submitted to this fussing with good grace, understanding that looking perfect was part of her job today. She practiced her wave in the mirror, wanting to make sure she did it just right for the balcony appearance. George needed no such preparations, his outfit still immaculate despite the long day. He stood quietly, mentally preparing himself for another public appearance. He knew that millions of people would be watching, that his image would appear in newspapers and on television around the world. The thought no longer paralyzed him with fear, but it still made him nervous. Louis had found a biscuit somewhere and was munching on it happily, oblivious to the importance of the coming moment. Kate gently cleaned his face, removing crumbs and making sure he looked presentable. She did not expect perfect behavior from him on the balcony, but she hoped he would at least appear cute for the cameras. The family began to assemble in order, preparing for the procession through the palace to the balcony room. Protocol dictated who would stand where on the balcony, with the king and queen at the center and other family members arranged by importance and relationship. William and his family would occupy prominent positions, visible to the crowd and cameras. They walked through the palace corridors, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. Palace staff bowed or curtsied as they passed, showing respect for the newly crowned king and his family. The building seemed to hum with energy, as if aware of the historic day unfolding within its walls. As they approached the balcony room, the roar of the crowd outside became audible again. Thousands of people packed the mall and the area in front of the palace, all waiting for this moment. Their voices created a continuous wall of sound, occasionally breaking into chants of "God Save the King," or simply cheering. William placed a reassuring hand on George's shoulder as they waited for the signal to step onto the balcony. He remembered his own first balcony appearance as a child, the overwhelming nature of the crowds and attention. He wanted his son to know that the nerves were normal, that everyone in the family had felt them at one time or another. The doors to the balcony opened, and the roar of the crowd intensified to an almost deafening level. The king stepped out first, followed by the queen, both of them emerging into the bright afternoon sunlight to face the massive crowd gathered below. The response was immediate and overwhelming, a tsunami of sound that seemed to shake the very air around them. William waited his turn, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves that always preceded major public appearances. No matter how many times he did this, the moment of stepping out into view of thousands of people never became completely routine. He could feel Kate beside him, her presence calming and grounding as always. George took a deep breath as his turn approached. Through the open doors, he could see the edge of the crowd, a sea of people that seemed to stretch forever. The noise was incredible, like nothing he had experienced before. His father's hand remained on his shoulder, steady and reassuring, giving him the courage to step forward. They walked onto the balcony as a family, and the crowd's reaction reached new heights. The sight of the Prince and Princess of Wales with their 3 children sparked particular enthusiasm. These were the faces of the monarchy's future, the reason many people felt confident that the institution would endure for generations to come. Charlotte emerged onto the balcony and immediately began waving with both hands, her face lit up with pure joy. The crowd responded to her enthusiasm with delighted cheers. She had no fear, no uncertainty, only the thrill of being part of something wonderful. Her exuberance was infectious, bringing smiles even to the faces of the more reserved family members. Kate positioned herself carefully, making sure the children were safe while also being visible to the crowd. She waved gracefully, her movements elegant and practiced. Years of royal training had taught her exactly how to stand, how to wave, how to present herself to maximum effect. But beneath the polished exterior, she felt genuine happiness at being part of this historic moment. Louis was lifted up so he could see better over the balcony railing. His eyes went wide at the sight of so many people, all of them looking up at the balcony, all of them waving and cheering. He waved back tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as he realized the crowd waved back at him. The interaction delighted him, and he began waving more enthusiastically. William stood tall and dignified, his wave measured and kingly, even though he was not yet the king. He scanned the crowd, seeing not just a mass of people but individuals, families, children on their parents' shoulders, elderly people who had witnessed previous coronations. These were the people he would one day serve as their monarch. And the weight of that responsibility felt heavier than ever. The king moved to the center of the balcony, positioning himself where tradition dictated. Centuries of monarchs had stood in this exact spot, had looked out at crowds celebrating their coronations. The continuity of it all was profound, a living link to history that could still stir the heart even in the modern age. George tried to take in everything at once. The size of the crowd, the palace guards in their ceremonial uniforms, the flags waving everywhere he looked, the photographers positioned to capture every moment. This was what his life would be, he realized. Public moments, ceremonies, crowds of people watching his every move. The thought was both thrilling and slightly overwhelming. Charlotte leaned against her mother, her initial burst of energy beginning to fade. The long day was catching up with her, but she maintained her smile for the cameras. She had been so good for so long, and she was determined to finish the day as perfectly as she had started it. Her small tiara caught the sunlight, making her look every inch a princess. Camera drones buzzed overhead, capturing aerial footage of the balcony scene and the massive crowd stretching down the mall. News helicopters circled at a respectful distance, their cameras trained on the palace. This moment was being broadcast around the world, watched by hundreds of millions of people across every continent. The Royal Air Force flypast began, the distant sound of aircraft engines growing louder. The crowd's attention shifted skyward as the planes approached, flying in perfect formation. This was one of the most anticipated moments of the day, a display of British military precision and tradition. The aircraft would pass directly over the palace, trailing colored smoke in red, white, and blue. George watched the sky eagerly, His love of aircraft temporarily overcoming his self-consciousness about being on display. He pointed as the first planes appeared, their shapes dark against the blue sky. Beside him, his father smiled at his son's enthusiasm, glad to see him acting like a normal boy rather than a future king for a moment. The planes roared overhead, their engines creating a thunderous sound that vibrated through everyone on the balcony. The colored smoke trails looked spectacular against the clear sky, and the crowd erupted in fresh cheers. Charlotte covered her ears at the noise but watched in wonder as the aircraft performed their carefully choreographed display. Louis waved at the planes, convinced they were waving back at him. His innocent enthusiasm brought smiles to the faces of the adults around him. At his age, the significance of the day was lost, but the excitement and spectacle were very real. He would have no memory of this coronation when he grew older, but photographs and videos would allow him to see himself as part of history. Kate felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched the fly past, overcome by the emotion of the moment. This was more than just planes flying overhead. It was a symbol of national pride, of military tradition, of the country coming together to celebrate. She blinked the tears away quickly, maintaining her composure for the cameras. As the last aircraft disappeared into the distance, the family remained on the balcony, continuing to wave at the crowd below. The people showed no signs of leaving, content to bask in the presence of their royal family for as long as possible. Some had traveled from distant parts of the country or even from abroad, and they wanted to savor every moment. William checked his watch discreetly, aware that they could not stay on the balcony indefinitely. There were other parts of the day's program still to come, and the family needed time to rest before evening events. But for now, they remained visible, giving the crowd the spectacle they had waited hours to see. George's arm was getting tired from waving, but he did not stop. He had been taught that duty came before personal comfort, that serving the public meant putting their needs above his own. At his young age, he was already learning the lessons that would shape his entire life. The crowd's enthusiasm made it easier to bear. Their genuine affection was palpable even from this height. Charlotte began to fidget slightly, and Kate knew it was nearly time to go back inside. They had given the crowd a good show, had fulfilled their role in the day's celebrations. Soon they could retreat to the private rooms of the palace, remove the formal clothing, and simply be a family rather than royal figures on display. The king raised his hand in a final wave, signaling that the balcony appearance was drawing to a close. The family took this cue, increasing the enthusiasm of their waves for one last moment before withdrawal. The crowd seemed to sense the ending too, their cheers reaching a final crescendo. They stepped back from the balcony railing, still visible to the crowd but preparing to leave. One by one, they turned and walked back through the doors into the palace. The roar of the crowd followed them inside, gradually muffling as the doors closed behind them. The sudden relative quiet felt almost shocking after the intensity of the noise outside. Inside, everyone seemed to deflate slightly, the formal posture relaxing now that they were out of public view. Charlotte immediately sat down, her feet hurting from standing so long. George rolled his shoulders, releasing tension he had not realized he was carrying. Louis wiggled free from the aide holding him and ran to his mother. Kate gathered her children close for a moment, proud of how well they had all done. Even Louis, who had fidgeted and needed bathroom breaks, had ultimately been adorable on the balcony. George had carried himself with dignity beyond his years, and Charlotte had charmed everyone with her natural enthusiasm. They had represented the family well. William embraced Kate briefly, a rare public display of affection that spoke to the emotion of the day. They had witnessed his father's coronation, had stood on the balcony as senior members of the royal family, had stepped further into their future roles. The day had been a success, but it had also been exhausting in ways that had little to do with physical tiredness. The king approached William, and father and son shared a moment of understanding. Charles had finally achieved what he had waited his entire life for, and William had watched his own future draw one step closer. They did not need words to communicate the complexity of their feelings. The crown had passed to a new head, but it would one day pass again. As the family dispersed to different rooms in the palace to rest and prepare for evening events, the significance of the day began to settle upon them. They had been part of history, had participated in a ceremony that would be remembered for generations. The children might not fully understand it now, but one day they would look back on this day and recognize its importance. George sat in a quiet corner, alone for the first time all day. He thought about everything he had seen and experienced, the ancient ceremony in Westminster Abbey,